Hi, I'm David Barr Kirtley, author of the book Save Me Please and Other Stories, and welcome to episode 573 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Robert Charles Wilson, author of more than a dozen novels, including The Chronoliths, Darwinia, and Julian Comstock, A Story of 22nd Century America. His 2005 novel Spin, about Earth being enclosed in a mysterious time bubble, won the Hugo Award for Best Novel. And in this interview, we'll be discussing his short story collection, The Perseids and Other Stories, and his nonfiction book, Owning the Unknown. A science fiction writer explores atheism, agnosticism, and the idea of God. And now here's our interview with Robert Charles Wilson. All right, so we're here with Robert Charles Wilson. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, and so your new book is called Owning the Unknown. So tell us about that.
Well, it's the subtitle is The Science Fiction Writer Explores Atheism, Agnosticism, and the Idea of God. It's my first book-length work of nonfiction. And what it tries to do is make a what I think of as a gentle defense of atheism through the medium of looking at these ideas in science fiction, the way I've encountered these ideas and used these ideas as a science fiction writer, and the way these ideas have played into my own experience and in many cases prompted me to do the kind of work I do as a science fiction writer.
So could you say kind of like what has been the relationship between science fiction and atheism in your own life? Did science fiction make you an atheist, or what is the relationship there?
Well, I can't honestly say that science fiction made me an atheist. I explain in the book that I come from a family that was in many ways conventionally religious, a Protestant family, but we didn't talk about religion at home. It was almost a taboo. The subject never came up. But I was always interested in, I was drawn to science fiction because I was interested in the past, the future, the way things change, the fact that the world as we see it now isn't the world as it has always been, and isn't the world as it will be sooner or later. I think that drew me to science fiction. But these are also ideas that play into conventional religion and religious ideas and theology. So I was drawn to those too. But from a perspective of someone who wasn't committed to a certain outcome, a certain ideological choice, these were ideas to explore, as the title implies, rather than ideas I had to defend. And they are deeply embedded in science fiction. And it was the interplay of those things that I think led me to a career in writing science fiction.
I mean, so some of the science fiction that you mention in this book is like Foundation, A Canticle for Leibowitz, Childhood's End, The Day the Earth Stood Still, Forbidden Planet, and A Case of Conscience. Could you say why those were some of the ones that you wanted to highlight in this book in particular?
Well, there were some obvious choices of stories that actually speak directly to the subject of religion and take various points of view on it. But the book isn't a catalog of what science fiction writers have had to say about religion. What's more important is the fact that they have always had something to say about religion, and that the genre itself it touches on subjects that are also central to religion. Maybe I should also say something about the particular genesis of the book. I had been for a few years delving around online in religious communities, religious blogs, Christian blogs, atheist blogs, getting down into the comment threads. And one of the things I realized is that once you take away the rancor, once you take away the angry disagreements, this conversation is deeply interesting, and it touches on an awful lot of things that are pertinent to science fiction. I mean, people in these religious conversations were talking about the Big Bang Theory, the multiverse theory, the origin of life, evolution. And often, of course, they were doing it in a disingenuous or ignorant way, but they were talking about the deeply interesting stuff. And again, once you take away the rancor, these are really interesting ideas to play with. And one of the things I tried to do in the book was discuss these things without implying that religious believers are stupid or delusional. I mean, we'd gone through a period of new atheism in which it was commonplace for atheists to speak scornfully of believers. And I didn't want to do that. I don't think these ideas are delusional. I happen to think they're wrong or in many cases mistaken. But I wanted to maybe engage in a kind of conversation that even a Christian or theistic believer could approach with some equanimity and get some value from.
Mm-hmm. I mean, like if I were to sort of try to summarize the book briefly, I would sort of say that your thesis is kind of that based on what we can know as human beings about ultimate underlying reality of the universe and everything, that just a basic sort of epistemic humility leads one to a position of not being able to assert, knowledge very definitively in a way that kind of comes very close to or amounts to atheism. Is that fair, would you say?
I think that's fair. I should emphasize that it's not a book that tells you whether God exists. The question of whether God exists has been debated by people much smarter than I am for centuries. And I'm not the guy who's going to solve that problem. But what I realize is that once we acknowledge that question is unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, however interesting it may be, then we have to ask ourselves another question, which is it reasonable for me, situated as I am and with the knowledge available to me, to believe in the existence of God? And to that, my answer was no. Very briefly, my answer was no, and the book explores some of the reasons for that and invites the reader, I think, to answer some of the same questions for him or herself.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, like I saw, I was looking at your Twitter feed, and there was some forum about religion that you used to comment on, and he reviewed the book. So, tell us about that. That was kind of interesting.
Oh yeah, that's Randall Rouser. He's a Christian apologist, a Canadian Christian apologist who, for many years, maintained a blog that was a kind of a meeting place for Christians and atheists, where you could actually have a discussion that was not vitriolic and didn't descend into insult, usually. And he's an interesting guy. He's gone on to do other work now, but he was he was that rare thing, someone who's in the business of defending Christian theology, who's actually fairly open-minded and willing to explore ideas that he doesn't necessarily share. He, for instance, wrote a book called "Is the Atheist My Neighbor?" In which he, referring obviously to the Christian injunction to love your neighbor, and hence you should be loving atheists. So a very charitably minded guy. So yeah, I spent a lot of time on his in his comment threads, sorting out a lot of the ideas that ended up in Owning the Unknown. Of course, it was an interest I had long before that. But as a way of clarifying these ideas, it was immensely useful to me.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in his review, he was kind of saying that, I mean, and this is something, just to let people know, I mean, I'm an atheist. I'm, very, about as much of an atheist as you can get. But so he was sort of saying in his review that, and this is a line that a lot of religious people will take sometimes, is that basically believing in a materialist scientific worldview is just as much of a act of faith as believing in any other worldview. And I've always found that very unpersuasive, that line of argument. But I'm wondering, what did you think of that review?
Oh, well, I think his criticisms are actually answered in the book. But there's this constant desire to put atheism, to define atheism as equivalent to religion, that we both have something unprovable that we happen to believe. That's why I was careful to not make metaphysical assertions, particularly in my book. I wanted make it very clear when I was talking about the observable universe. We can say that materialism gives us a good description of the observable universe, without implying that it's a description of all reality at all times, in all places, no matter how ontologically remote or cosmologically distant from us. That kind of epistemic humility can't apply to a belief in a God that governs all reality at all times and is the author of all reality at all times and all places. When you assert that God exists, at least that kind of transcendent metaphysical God, you're making a knowledge claim about all of reality at all time. And one of the things I have to say about myself is that I don't have any reliable knowledge about reality at all times and all places. So that's kind of the approach I took. I also don't want people to think this is a book of dry philosophy. It's a book that talks in part about my personal experience with these ideas, both through science fiction and in my own life. And I like to think it's kind of funny, and it's got jokes, and it talks about these things in a colloquial way. So yeah, if you're looking for a work of philosophy or of religion, there are better books to look for. And that is an interesting subject to explore. But if you're looking for a defense of that, what I called intuitive atheism, I think I make a fairly good one, and I think I do it in a reasonably entertaining way.
Yeah, well, I guess yeah. Let's come back to the science fiction angle, because I thought it was interesting how you talk about finding the science fiction community in the 70s and just what a wild ferment of ideas and conflicting viewpoints and crackpot ideas and all this stuff it was. You call it at one point, I think, a teapot bohemia. What was it like discovering this teapot bohemia?
Yeah, that's very much what it was for me. Coming from a fairly ordinary background, my interest in these ideas was something that I didn't really share with a whole lot of other people, a few friends maybe, and then wandering into the science fiction, the fanish community, where I met people with all kinds of diverse beliefs, good and bad ideas, scores of them, a Star Wars cantina of diverse beliefs, not just about religion or philosophy, but about sexuality and politics. It was exhilarating. I think atheism was pretty much the default setting for most of the people I came across, but by no means was that an exhaustive description of the people I met and made friends with in the science fiction community.
I mean, some notable exceptions to scientific rationalism you mentioned are some of John W. Campbell's editorials, like L. Ron Hubbard's Dianetics, and Philip K. Dick believing that he was in telepathic contact with first century Christians. Kind of what was your response to that kind of stuff going on?
Yeah, it's an interesting, it seems to me there's a kind of thread in science fiction where we have, especially writers of my generation and the generation before it, writers of the golden age, as we called it, loved a lot of ideas that definitely wouldn't be categorized as scientific materialism. The romance with telepathy and the hidden powers of the mind definitely outpaced whatever fragile scientific basis it appeared to have at one time. And again, at one end of the spectrum of the writers I read, there were writers like, Lovecraft, who had links both with atheism and with all those bizarre ideas that came out of theosophy and ideas of, ancient ancestral races and weird stuff like that. We've, as a genre, we've played with these ideas with some very outre ideas. But I think that's the point, is that we've played with them. We haven't devoted ourselves to them or defended them. We've played with them, which seems like the sensible thing to do if you're interested in this kind of stuff. It's by nature speculative. So let's have fun. Let's speculate about it.
So, I mean, I guess speaking of the occult stuff, I mean, I'll mention I also read your short story collection. It's called The Perseids and Other Stories, which I really enjoyed. And a lot of the stories in there have to do with characters who are interested in the occult. There's mentions of people like Gurdjieff, Uspensky, Velikovsky, Blavatsky. Are these things that you are interested in, or how much did you ever get into that?
You come across this a lot of this stuff if you're a science fiction writer, and I guess in those stories I was trying to a lot of those stories I was trying to get at the borderline between what we know and what we don't know, and what happens to people when they come up against that border, when they come up against the boundaries of the strange. We're bounded on all sides by wonder, as H.G. Wells once said, north, south, east, and west. So yeah, I like putting my characters in that position where they're confronted with something they don't understand, perhaps more powerful than they are. Yeah, a lot of the stories do. Many of them are not what I would definitely call hard science fiction. Many of them aren't even soft science fiction. They border on fantasy and they border on horror. It's the appeal of the strange. It's I think for people like me who were children in the 1950s and grew up in the 60s and the 70s, we remember a time when what was strange was kind of culturally forbidden. It was suspect. It was something for weirdos. It was something for beatniks, right? And nevertheless, we were drawn to it. And the genre was a deep well of it.
Well, let me ask you. So one of the lines, it says, "Some of my generation of post-war suburban children hid copies of Allen Ginsberg's Howl under their mattresses. Some of us hid copies of Robert A. Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land." So that was you hiding Stranger in a Strange Land?
Yeah, that was. I had the first paperback edition of that. Avon Books put it out. It had a picture on the cover of a half-naked man representing Valentine Michael Smith, the protagonist of the novel. And the back cover had a prominently featured blurb about forthright sex. And I literally had to hide this from my parents, as we didn't talk about a lot about religion at home, but they were very conservative. We were a very conservative family, and my parents frowned on some of the books I brought home, so I learned not to show them some things. I wasn't going to not bring the books home. I wasn't going to not read them. So I just, read them quietly and kept them out of sight. Yeah, that was one of the books.
You say, to his credit, Heinlein didn't accept the hippie guru mantle that was offered to him. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, he could have, with the attention he kind of got in the latter part of the 60s, he could have pulled a Hubbard. He could have made money that way. Or he could have just gloried in the attention. But I think to his credit as a writer, he was skeptical of it. I don't think he entirely approved of the people that were attracted to his book in that way. And I think that takes a certain kind of honesty to actually refract some of that public attention.
I've heard the same thing said of Frank Herbert, that he could have become sort of a guru with the sort of following he developed, and just was not interested in doing that at all. Yeah,
probably so.
I mean, in your story that's in the Perseids and other stories, it's called The Inner City. It starts off with there's this group of characters, sort of academics and so on, and they meet periodically and have these little challenges. And the challenge that comes up at the beginning of the story is they're challenging each other to invent their own religion. And that obviously made me think of L. Ron Hubbard. If people, maybe I'll just explain, if anyone listening doesn't know, L. Ron Hubbard he's a science fiction author, and he invented Scientology. And it's widely said within the science fiction field that he told various people that he was doing it to make money, that the only way to get rich in America was to start your own religion. So I imagine that sort of influenced that story, or?
Yeah, well, that certainly played into it. I think also maybe my sense that there's that these ideas are fun to play with, but there's a certain danger in taking them too literally. Not exactly the danger my protagonist in that story falls into, but I don't know. I value my skepticism. I think it's taken me to good places. It's let me play with ideas without investing too much in them. People do have a tendency to fall in love with ideas, and that often takes them to places where they have to defend ideas in unattractive ways. Every time I've been an enthusiast for some idea that I later came to regret. There was a time in my teen years when I read Ayn Rand, I'm ashamed to say. But the farther you follow those ideas and look at the roots of them and look at the implications of it, the more and more you get that little feeling like, there's something wrong here. This doesn't work. This leads me to a place that I don't like. And you learn to trust those feelings. And it's that kind of intuitive skepticism that I think is something that we need to have packed in our kit bag when we're playing with ideas about the nature of reality or God or the supernatural in particular.
I've heard people say that science fiction writers are kind of like latter-day theologians, and therefore by implication theologians are kind of proto-science fiction writers. Kind of, what do you think of that idea?
Well, I don't like people thinking of us as theologians because that assumes a prior commitment to a religious idea.
But it's sort of like the same sort of person who would have been a theologian in the first century becomes a science fiction writer. I don't know. I've heard people suggest that.
Well, there were, there's a tradition of, even in Christianity, there's a tradition of miracle stories that goes back to antiquity. There are apocryphal books of the Bible. There are childhood narratives of Jesus. Apocryphal, I emphasize, and not part of the canon, but written in the first century, the second century. That try to imagine what Jesus was doing with his supernatural or miraculous powers as a child. And there's some charming stories of. There's a story of the young Jesus killing some adults who made fun of him, and then shamefully bringing him back to life, and admitting his mistake. This strikes me as very science fiction-like stuff. Somebody taking a story like the gospel stories and trying to find new implications and draw out the unwritten implications and write the unwritten stories about them. Now, these were intended as devotional stories, and they were written in a Christian context by Christians in Christian communities. So in a sense, they were apologetic, but the playfulness of them and the narrative impulses that drive them, that does seem to be kind of in the realm of what science fiction writers are doing today.
Yeah, it does. When you find out about all these apocryphal stories, it really does make you think of like Marvel Comics or something, where they're just spinning out every, this minor character gets their own series for a while, and then they're like, no, this was dumb, we're going to retcon all that, just forget that. That never happens, and only this is the real canon. That's why it does seem to me that the sort of, I can see the same personality type, kind of being drawn to one or the other depending on the time they're in.
Yeah. I think, though, for us as science fiction writers, there's not as much at stake.
Yeah.
If you're a Christian, the idea of a Christian afterlife, for instance, means you have a lot at stake. The idea of being culpable for sin, if you have the wrong belief, means there's a lot at stake. But as atheists or agnostics, we don't have that burden. We're free to play with these ideas simply because we don't have that kind of investment in them. I don't feel like my eternal afterlife is at risk. I didn't feel like my eternal afterlife was at risk when I wrote the stories in the Perseids. That's a kind of freedom that we have that the theologically minded maybe don't.
What do you? I've heard a lot of people talk about, say, transhumanism and the technological singularity as sort of like a science fiction religion. People sometimes jokingly refer to it as the rapture of the nerds. I was just curious.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Well, these are certainly interesting ideas, and I've played with them in the past in my own novels and stories. Um, they trouble me when they become almost devotional. Um, they trouble me when people use them as excuses for bad politics. Um, they trouble me when people use them for self-aggrandizement. Um, we don't know what the upshot of things like artificial intelligence or the potential for, say, a general artificial intelligence. We don't know what's going to come out of those things. That's what makes it interesting. That's what makes it fun to speculate about. Um, to assume that some outcome is predetermined or that it will necessarily be benevolent, I think is deeply, profoundly mistaken.
I mean, do you have any hope of immortality through technology? I mean, I have a couple examples here that people talk about a lot in science fiction. So the one I just mentioned, transhumanism, you have the simulation hypothesis, the idea that maybe we're already inside a computer simulation, and so who knows what'll happen to us after we die. There's the idea that maybe we'll die, but someday there'll be advanced technology that will be able to resurrect us. And then there's the idea of quantum immortality, which you play with in your story, Divided by Infinity, which is basically the idea that if we're in a universe of branching timelines, of which anything can happen, then in some of those timelines, you'll survive in increasingly improbable ways forever. So some versions of you will keep surviving forever. So do you have any hope of immortality through anything along those lines?
Well, I honestly don't know whether it's possible, but there's I'm writing a piece of fiction at the moment that makes the assumption that if a technologically enabled afterlife is possible, then any advanced civilization will have already invested in it, will have created one for themselves. That opens a whole new load of possibilities. If you are in a disembodied, kind of technologically enabled afterlife, then things that are difficult for us in our physical bodies become possible. Traveling virtually at the speed of light, for instance, taking time dilation in our stride, creating cultures that expand over light years, creating intelligences, vast, slow intelligences that extend over light years. How such a culture might interact with a culture like ours that is perhaps within a century or a millennium of creating our own afterlife. It's one of those ideas. Much of our technology consists of making practical things that we've often dreamed about. We've often dreamed about the idea of a pill or a plant that could cure your disease. But it wasn't until the 20th century that we came up with any reasonable number of pills that could cure a reasonable number of diseases. We have always dreamed of an afterlife, of persisting after death, if it becomes technologically practical to implement something like that. Well, I'm certain we would do it. I have no idea what the consequences would be, but it's an enormous amount of fun to think about.
Mm-hmm. One of the things you said in the book is you say toxic credulity has become a conspicuous threat to democratic governance in the first quarter of the century. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think we've all seen what can happen when misinformation becomes rampant, denialism becomes rampant, disregard for evidence becomes rampant, disregard for expertise becomes rampant. We have now it's entirely possible to silo yourself with other people who share some belief you have that you don't like to see challenged evidentially. And when you do that, you inevitably put yourself in the company of other beliefs that like to hide from evidence. If you're a creationist and you go into creationist spaces on the web, you're eventually going to meet flat earthers. You're going to meet the QAnon crowd. You're going to meet the people who think, the Biden administration is run by lizard people. And the danger of insulating yourself from the idea of evidence is that you have nothing with which to challenge these ideas, and you've cultivated in yourself a credulity that might make them seem all too plausible.
Yeah, I mean, that's always been my kind of concern, when people say, well, like, I can't justify this religious belief rationally, but it makes me feel good, so I'm going to choose to believe it. It's like, okay, even granting that this particular religious belief is harmless or beneficial, it just seems like the habits of thought that allow you to accept things that aren't well evidenced can't help but lead you into trouble at some point down the line where you encounter some related or, belief that isn't well evidenced, but is maybe a little bit more pernicious.
Sure. I think what I say in the book is that people are certainly entitled to their cherished metaphysical beliefs, but they're not entitled to use those metaphysical beliefs as evidence, and they're not entitled to use those metaphysical beliefs to dismiss evidence in matters that can be decided evidentially, like the age of the Earth, for instance. You may believe that a God exists and created the cosmos, but that isn't evidence for the age of the Earth. It simply isn't. And it can't be deployed that way. I tend to leave people alone if they have what I described as a beloved metaphysical belief. Say that there's something more powerful than us in the universe, say, or one day I'll be reunited with, my loved ones after death. Okay, I can't tell you you're wrong. It's just I can't share that belief on the basis that you assert it. And you really can't use that belief, as much as you may love it, to tell me I'm wrong about something. So, I tend to give people as much slack as I can. I don't believe Christians, for instance, are necessarily stupid or silly people or delusional. I just think we have to set these boundaries in what we're willing to accept, especially in arguments to which evidence is applicable.
You say in the book that over your lifetime, both science fiction and atheism went from being very, very marginal when you were young to being very, very mainstream now. I'm just curious. And you say that those parallel trajectories, I would suggest, are not entirely uncoincidental. Just kind of, what has it been like for you watching that change happen in both of those? Yeah,
it's very weird. It's been that the people, I think maybe people forget now that science fiction was once an extremely marginal genre with no prestige whatsoever. We still see traces of that here and there, but no, it was once something. It was once something you had to look for. It wasn't at every neighborhood theater. It was a tiny section in the bookstore. It was maybe a shelf in the local library. You had to hunt out, once you'd exhausted the small canon of easily accessible works, you had to hunt for stuff. I think it's why so many writers and readers of my generation read broadly into the history of the genre, maybe more than people do now, just because if you wanted more, you had to go find it. So you found Jules Verne, you found H.G. Wells, you found some of the writers of the 30s. You went back and looked for obscure works. You really dug into the corners and shadows of the genre because you wanted more, and there wasn't that much more. It's an appetite that's really easy to satisfy now. I think the boomer generation had a lot to do with that. I mean, our fondness for science fiction practically turned it into, our appetite for it, I should say, practically turned it into an industry, made it a mainstay of cinema and television, made it a moneymaker for the publishing industry, as long as the publishing industry had moneymakers. I guess I worry now that some of those impulses that drove the appetite for science fiction, kind of intellectual curiosity, uh, and that drove a fascination with science, the same kind of intellectual curiosity. I worry, and maybe this is just an old guy's anxiety, but I worry that they may be lapsing a little bit, that it's harder to find that appetite for new knowledge and curiosity in the cultural environment we're in at the moment.
Well, I mean, it was striking me reading the passage I mentioned earlier about John W. Campbell and L. Ron Hubbard and Philip K. Dick and so on. I mean, like, obviously I'm not particularly persuaded by any of their ideas, but there was something sort of interesting and exciting about the idea of a science fiction field that was broad enough to encompass this incredible range of eccentrics and crackpots and countercultural figures and things. And I do feel that we've kind of lost that a little bit as it's become more corporate and more, academic and whatever you would say, that, I kind of miss a little bit of that counterculture, vibe that used to have.
Well, science fiction had a countercultural moment at a time when there really was a dominant culture, one that you were supposed to be a part of, that had fixed ideas about what was good and what was bad. The whole point of a counterculture is to stand in opposition to that. And the countercultural tendency in science fiction was a part of that. I think now that seems archaic because our dominant culture is fractured in so many ways. It's hard to know what stands counter to it. It feels more like we live in a collection of subcultures now than in a single dominant culture, prescriptive dominant culture, to which we can stand in opposition. It's just a different moment. I don't think, science fiction can be that countercultural thing that it once was in, say, the 50s and the 60s and the 70s.
Okay, so we're pretty much out of time, so we'll have to wrap this up pretty soon. I guess I did want to ask you, I mean, I mentioned that so many of the stories in the Perseids and other stories have to do with the occult and sort of religious sorts of ideas. So I was wondering if you wanted to say which of your novels do you think maybe people should check out? I haven't read it, but you have a novel called about Julian Comstock that it sounded like it dealt pretty directly with religion in the future United States.
Yeah. If you're interested in that subject, Julian Comstock was a fun book to write. I think it's a fun book to read. My most successful novel was Spin, which won the Hugo Award and a few other awards in its year, and it's probably been my most widely translated and widely reprinted novel. So if people want to check out my work, those two would be good places to dig in.
Mm-hmm. I also, I guess, just curious, in so many of these stories, in the Perseids and other stories, there's this reference to Finder's Bookshop. And I just noticed that it's on Harvard Street. And I know there's a science fiction bookstore in Toronto called Baka Phoenix, which is, I just looked up, is on Harvard Street. So I was wondering if that's a little reference there. Or
it's Finder's was based on a used bookstore in Toronto called Seekers. There was a store called Seekers. It was on Bloor Street, actually. It was one of those stores that's on a lower level. You had to go down a set of stairs. And it was dedicated to occult and weird books. And it had a science fiction section, so I would pop in there occasionally. The guy, I don't know if he was the owner, but the guy at the checkout desk would always give you an editorial on whatever book you bought. Tell you why you would enjoy it or why it was a crappy book. So when I started to write those stories, I needed an imaginary bookstore. It actually wasn't Baka, which is a science fiction in the landmark community here in Toronto. It was actually that now defunct little hidden away occult bookstore called Seekers that I was thinking of.
That's funny. Okay, so I guess just finally, are there any other projects you want to mention? I think you mentioned you're working on something new now. Do you want to say anything you can say about that?
Yeah, my work has slowed down a lot. I mean, I'm 70 years old this year. and I've slowed down a lot as a writer, but I have a novel in progress that's nearly completed. It's called 40 Million Summers. It deals with what I was talking about earlier, the idea of human beings interacting with alien cultures that have long since discovered and put into effect an artificial afterlife, and how this has been good and bad for them, and how we as a unique human species would react to having something like that made available to us. And yeah, it's set both in the present and, as the title would suggest, 40 million years in the future. I'm quite pleased with it. I don't have a publisher for it yet, but we'll see where it goes from here.
Yeah, well, it sounds really cool. Hopefully we'll be hearing more about that soon. But yeah, so I think we're going to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Robert Charles Wilson about his new book, Owning the Unknown. So Bob, thank you so much for joining us.
Yep, great to be here.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Robert Charles Wilson for joining us on the show. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.